On.
Hey guys, my name is Shaya Molinex, and for my final project, the problem that I saw was that when a child faces some sort of abuse, whether physical, mental, emotional, or sexual, there are usually some side effects, and some of those are short term and others are long term. So, my goal with this was to look at the short term and long term effects of abuse and see how individuals can cope with those throughout life. In one of the articles I read, there were a few quotes that stood out to me, and I just copied those on here. And those were childhood abuse causes a manifestation of mental, emotional, and physical health issues over the lifespan. There's a vicious cycle that children who experience abuse face in life. And abuse causes a cascade of emotional insecurities, disruption to crucial development stages, and triggers of stress. All these factors attribute to the increased risk of mental health illness and substance abuse tendencies that have a negative ramification on the child's physical health throughout his or her life. So, in the book, there were some common myths or misconceptions, and I just thought they were really interesting. So, the first one was if an individual was abused or neglected as a child, he or she will abuse or neglect his or her children. So, in many studies, the parent who abused their child was also abused as a child, but this doesn't mean that every person who is abused will become an abuser. There's a possibility that they're able to change that pattern and become a good parent. The second one that was that those who were abused or neglected as children will become adults who are involved in crime, drugs, and prostitution. So many individuals involved in this type of activity were abused or neglected, but not all victims of abuse turn towards this lifestyle. A quote that I found was, "For every inmate of a correctional facility who was abused as a child, there may be 50 or more who were abused but have not turned toward deviant behavior." The third myth was the effects of abuse and neglect can never be fixed, which means the individual will be unable to lead a fulfilling and happy life. So, being abused or neglected as a child does have a huge effect on adulthood, and many victims learn how to cope with this, and they're able to regain control of their life and have a happy and fulfilling life. So these are some of the effects from the neglecting family. And as I go through these next few slides, you'll notice that a lot of these are the same for different types of abuse. So the first one was trust. So they have a difficult time trusting themselves, others, or the environment. The second one was anger. So they feel that their childhood wasn't fair, and they can use their anger inward or outward, and inward would be depression and self abusive behaviors, or the outward would be aggressive towards others or delinquent behavior. There were relational imbalances, so they have a hard time forming satisfying relationships. There was low self esteem, so they feel at fault, worthless, or to blame for what happened. They have impaired social skills, so since they feel negatively about themselves, they have a hard time interacting with others. There's substance abuse. So this is a cultural issue, but it's a form of escape and a means to ease social interaction. So this is tied to it. And then there's physical problems. So insufficient care can cause health problems like impeded growth, lower intelligence, poor teeth, and many other problems. And to the right, there is a chart, and it just shows that 59% of abuse is actually neglect. So the biggest part of abuse is actually neglect. So these are the effects of physically abusing family, and like I said, they're pretty much the same. So there's trust, anger, relational imbalances, low self-esteem, and one that was different were coping skills. So they battle these feelings of powerlessness, and they usually escape through substance abuse, and they're unable to play or enjoy themselves. And a shocking statistics that I saw in another article was that in the US, 2 to 3 children die per day due to child abuse. These are effects from a sexually abusing family. These are a little different. There's betrayal, so they felt like they should be able to trust the person who abused them, and they feel betrayed because they can't trust that person. And they realize that they were just being used for the abuser's pleasure. There's traumatic sexualization, so they confuse sex and affection, and they have a distorted perception of sexual norms. There's stigmatization and self esteem, and this is deep feelings of guilt, shame, and badness, and they have a negative view of themselves. Powerlessness, and they don't feel like they have any control in their life, and that usually leads to like nightmares, phobias, and attacks of anxiety that remind them of the abuse. There's anger again and relational imbalances, and then there's multiple victimization, and women are more likely to go through this. And then it said that victims of incest had a higher rate of repeat victimization than those who were not incest victims. So I didn't find as many on emotional abuse, but I would say those are very similar to all the other ones, and these were just a couple that I found that were different. There's negative self-evaluation, which is low self-esteem, anxiety, interpersonal sensitivity, which I did look this one up online, and it said that that is the ability to accurately assess others' abilities, states, and traits from nonverbal cues. So it's like the idea that it takes one to know one, and then they also go through depression. So this is just a video. We're not going to watch the whole thing, but it just kind of talks about like real life scenarios, and it says it's just for sexual abuse, but it kind of pertains to all the different abuse, and I think that it could be about all of them.
Well, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is when our children are abused, whether it's sexually, physically, emotionally, those scars stay with children, in essence, sometimes for a lifetime. And then it manifests itself in underperforming children in school. They potentially act out and they get involved with law enforcement and other problems. And then they lose hope in their life.
You know, I think back now, and again, she destroyed me, period, emotionally. She took the me out of me.
I think it's a struggle for children, and I think it goes on through most of their lives for many of them, especially if they don't get treatment.
Many children, go down a path, or adults go down a path of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, promiscuity, prostitution. It runs the gamut. You can act in or you can act out, and so there are real life-threatening consequences from being a victim of sexual assault.
I ended up rebelling. I would fight everybody. I was always angry. I was a very, very angry person. And that led me to go to juvenile.
One of the things I do.
So as you can see, those can be tied, those facts can be tied to all kinds of abuse. So these are a couple of ways that people can cope with abuse, and I know there's many others, but these are just a few that I saw over and over, and I thought that they were the more helpful ways maybe. So the first one was psychological escapes, and this is where the survivor buries their memories of the abuse so they can go on with their life and maybe not ever think about it or not let it affect them. There's support seeking, so they look to outside sources for help and find others who have been through the same things as them. Action oriented, so they base all of their actions on the idea of avoiding the abuser, so they wouldn't go certain places if they knew their abuser could be there or if it reminded them of the abuse. There's cognitive appraisal, so they would be at peace with what happened to them and they knew they weren't to blame for what had happened, and they just try to understand why those things happen, and many times they see it as it could have been much worse than what it actually was. There's positive reframing, and this is kind of a unique way to cope. So they convince him or herself that the abuse benefited him or her in some way. And like an example of that would be that the abuse made them more assertive and aware of their surroundings. There's individual therapy. So there's many variations of this, but it's just when the individual talks to a therapist that's educated and skilled in the area where they need help. Group therapy, so many therapists recommend it because it allows the victims to see that they're not alone and it helps them open up. And then there's self-help groups, and so this is like the support seeking that I talked about on the previous slide, and it's just looking for others who've been through the same things as you. So my conclusion is that it's important that people realize that everyone deals with abuse. They face it in a different way, and something that works for one person may not work for the next. So we just need to help people or victims find the exact coping mechanism that works for them and not make them feel bad about not using the same coping mechanism as someone else.